بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله تعالى وبارك وسلم على سيدنا محمد ختم الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. وقد نوينا تعلم تعليم وتذكر وتذكير ونفع والانتفاع والإفادة والاستفادة والحث على التمسك بكتاب الله وسنة نبيه والدعاء إلى الهدى والدلالة على خير وكل ما نواه مشايخنا ابتغاء وجه الله وثوابه وقربه. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما نافعا يا كريم. Alhamdulillah, in our lessons in Hanafi Fiqh, we have reached the section of menstruation, which is of the most important sections of purification. And we've mentioned certain things about it, but we will start from the beginning, just with a review of what we've covered and continuing from there. Just as to preface this class, it's it is obligatory for a woman to keep track of her menstruation, right? Because a lot of the knowledge of the menstruation depends on her keeping track of her previous menstruations as well, right? Specifically the most recent menstruation, because we have in certain situations, as we'll come to today, that in the case where there is a discrepancy of whether this is menstruation, this blood is menstruation, or it's what we call dysfunctional bleeding, istihada, right? Then we will go back to what was her, how many days was her menstruation last time, right? So if one does not know that, then a lot of the rulings are very difficult to determine, and she may end up not praying when she should be praying, or praying when she should not be praying, and that's problematic, right? So the scholars, they mentioned that just as it is obligatory for someone who has wealth to keep track of their wealth in regards to the rulings of zakat, it is obligatory for a woman to keep track of her menstruation for the rulings of prayer. Right, so just to recap, the menstruation itself, right, has a very specific meaning in Islamic law. It is a type of blood that comes from the uterus of a woman, and the blood coming out is not due to any sickness. It's not due to some other secondary cause. Right. Secondly, it does not come out during pregnancy. Right. And third, that it only comes out after a woman has reached the minimum age in which it's possible for her to have puberty. Right. So a prepubescent girl would not have menstruation if there's any blood that is seen. Right. Then that is not considered menstruation. The rules of menstruation do not apply to her. Okay. Thirdly, it has to, the minimum amounts that the blood must continue for is 3 days, 72 hours. So there must be blood for 3 days, right, in order for it to be considered menstruation, because there's a minimum, which is 3 days. The maximum is 10 days, which adds up to about 240 hours, right? Even though the average is around between 2 to 5 days. So the minimum, in order for it to be considered menstruation, is 3 days. The maximum is 10 days, right? So that's one type of, one issue that pertains to women. The second issue that pertains to women is postnatal bleeding, istihada. And postnatal bleeding is the blood that is seen directly after the child is born, right? Right, so the blood may even be on the child itself, right? So anytime there's blood seen directly after pregnancy, or after giving birth, I should say, right? Then that blood is called nifas, right? That's postnatal bleeding, right? Its minimum there is no minimum, right? Even just one drop, right? If there's one drop of blood after the baby when the baby comes out, then the mother would require a ghusl before her next prayer. But it could last up to a maximum of 40 days. Right. So those are the two main things, and those are the only issues that relate to the rulings of menstruation. So both the rulings of menstruation apply to the menstruation itself and to the nifas, the postnatal bleeding, right? So the rulings which we have mentioned, but we'll mention again, right, that intercourse is prohibited, right? She cannot touch the Quran, she cannot recite the Quran, right, and so forth. And we'll talk about contemporary issues as well, right? Anything that is besides that, any bleeding that does not fulfill those criteria is not called menstruation, nor is it called nifas. And the rulings of menstruation and nifas do not apply on such a woman, right? So if there is bleeding, right, but it's only for 2 days and then it stops completely, right? Or there's bleeding above and beyond 10 days, right, for in menstruation, or a woman is pregnant and during the pregnancy she's bleeding, not during, right, not after the birth, but during the pregnancy itself, or a woman who is below the minimum age of puberty, which is 9 years old. Uh, uh, a girl, a very young girl, experiences bleeding, that is not considered menstruation. Or a woman who is above the age of 55, if she experiences bleeding, then that is not considered menstruation. It's considered dysfunctional uterine bleeding, right? And with the exception that if it comes, as some of the scholars said, that if she experiences bleeding after that, and it's exactly the same way that she is used to having her menstruation, then it will be considered menstruation. Okay. So he says, if the bleeding is for less than 3 days or more than 10 days, then it's, meaning the excess, that which goes above the 10 days, or that which is below the 3 days, is not menstruation. Rather, it is dysfunctional uterine bleeding, which is called istihada. Right? Which is istihada. Right? In the case of istihada, a woman will still pray, right? A woman will, she is still able to read the Quran, touch the Quran, right? There is still, it's allowed to have intercourse, right? The rulings do not apply. Okay. Right. So when we talk about 3 days or 10 days, right? It is not a condition that the blood be continuous throughout those 72 hours or 240 hours, right? Nor is it a condition that the blood must be a specific color. Right? So any color that is seen within that time period, right, as well as any moments of where there's no blood coming out, there's intermittent breaks in the bleeding, right? All of that is included in the 10 days, right? And is considered menstrual blood. So whether it's a dark color or a light color or opaque, right? As long as it's not white. I mean, if it's pure white, then that's a sign that the menstruation is over. Right. So that is, so for instance, if a woman has blood for 3 days and then nothing for 1 day, and then another day she has another blood. So all of that is considered. Even the days in between where there's no blood is added together, right? Because it's on the basis of the beginning and the end. So, and we'll take specific questions near the end, inshallah. Okay, so when she does have this menstrual blood, right? It is thus, it prevents her from being able to pray or fast, right? But she will have to make up the fasts, right? So if she has her menstruation during Ramadan, right, or postnatal bleeding during Ramadan, then she has to calculate how many days she did not fast, because she cannot fast. She cannot fast during her menstruation. So she has to calculate how many days and then make it up on another day, right? But as for the prayers, she does not pray as well, but she does not have to make up the prayers. Right? She does not have to make up the prayers, because making up 7 days of, right, 5 prayers a day for 7 days is considered haraj, undue hardship, whereas making up 5 or 7 fasts and having the whole year to do it, right, is not seen so. right? And this is directly from the Prophet ﷺ, where Sayyidah Aisha, she mentions that the Prophet commanded us to make up our fasts, but not our prayers, meaning after menstruation. Okay, so during menstruation or postnatal bleeding, okay, it is prohibited to have sexual intercourse. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, يَسَأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الْمَحِيضِ قُلْ هِيَ أَذًى فَاعْتَزِلُوا النِّسَاءَ فِي الْمَحِيضِ. They ask you regarding menstruation, say that it is harmful, right? So to separate from the women and during menstruation. Now that separation does not mean that one cannot stay with a woman or eat from the same plate, or right. And those were a lot of the rulings that the Jewish people had before the time of the Prophet ﷺ, right? And those were all abrogated, right? There is no basis to that. The only meaning of separate from the women is not to have intercourse. Right? It means not to have intercourse. Everything else is fine. Right? So intercourse is prohibited. Right? To perform the tawaf is prohibited. Right? So if she is in Hajj, then she can plan it so that she delays the Hajj slightly. She delays the tawaf till the end of Hajj. Right? Or if she fears that she might have her haid eventually, then she can do the tawaf early. And she cannot enter the mosque. She cannot enter the masjid, and that specifically applies to the part of the building, and that is designated for the prayer. Right. So many masjids, they have a foyer, a courtyard, offices. They have a public area. Right. And only the part which is designated for the prayer is considered the masjid itself, which is where the prohibition lies. But if she goes to the offices or to the auditorium or to, right, then that is not prohibited, right? And we'll talk about some things. The fourth is what they call istimta', right? Marital intimacy. So it is impermissible for the husband to touch his wife during the menstruation between the navel and the knees with skin-to-skin contact. Skin-to-skin contact between the navel and the knees is prohibited during menstruation, right? Just as it is prohibited for him to touch, it is prohibited for her to allow him to touch between her navel and knees with skin-to-skin contact. Now, besides that area between the navel and the knees, right, everything else is permissible for the husband to touch, even if it's skin to skin, right? It's permissible, right, for her to allow, right? And it is permissible to touch between the navel and the knees if there is a barrier, right? What is prohibited is skin to skin contact between the navel and the knees. So if there is a barrier, then even between the navel and the knees, right, it is permissible to touch. Okay. Right. And that touching, the skin to skin contact between the navel and the knees is prohibited, whether it's with desire or not, right? Regardless, it's just, right, it is not conditioned by the presence of desire, right, and such. Number 5 is the recitation of Quran. Recitation of Quran is prohibited for anyone who is in a state of menstruation, postnatal bleeding, or even a person who is in a major state of ritual impurity. It is prohibited to recite the Quran. Now, in regards to a woman who has menstruation, right, or postnatal bleeding, right, the prohibition is that the Quran is not allowed to be recited, right, audibly, right? But a woman can recite in her heart without audibly pronouncing the words of the Quran. She can even read from the Mus'haf without touching it. Right? She can read, but not reading out loud, but reading in her heart. And she can look at the text if it's open in front of her and she's not touching it. Right? She can do that as well. Now, there is other opinions in other schools in which a woman who, if she fears that her memorization of the Quran will become weakened, then or she fears that she will not be able to hold on to her memorization because of having to stop every time she gets her menstruation, then other schools like the Maliki madhab, right, have allowed that in the case of that necessity, right? And that can be used if, for instance, someone has a memorization class, or someone is actively memorizing the Quran, right? The best would be not to take that dispensation. But if that is a reality, that one truly fears that their memorization is being weak, right, then they can take that opinion. Also, if someone is used to, has a daily recitation of certain surah, certain chapters of the Quran, like generally people would read Surah Yasin every day, maybe even Surah Waqi'ah or Surah Mulk before sleeping, right? And that's their habit to do so. Then during the menstruation, they can still recite that, right? Especially according to other schools as well, because its recitation is more of a type of remembrance than it is specifically just reciting Quran, right? So there's secondary meanings attached to it, and that would be more considered like awrad, or right, these ritual exercises or ritual deeds that we do, right? Than it would be from Quran. So, right, so there is some vastness in the matter, right? And secondly, anything that's said out of, right, for the sake of dua is not considered prohibited. Like, for instance, when somebody said, "Rabbana atina fid dunya hasana fil akhirati hasana wa qina adhaban nar," right? That is a verse of Quran, but it's being used as a dua, right? It's not being read with the intention of reciting Quran, right? Likewise, Alhamdulillah or Surah Fatiha, right, before sleeping, for instance, right? Or the last, or saying Surah Ikhlas, right, 3 times before sleeping, or the last 3 quls 3 times, right, and so forth, because it's not read directly with the intention of reciting Quran, but more specifically because of the prophetic sunnah. Okay. Number 6 is touching a copy of the Quran unless within a non-attached barrier. Right? This applies to a person who doesn't have wudu, right, as well as the woman with menstruation or postnatal bleeding, or anyone in a state of impurity. Touching the Quran itself, the copy of the Quran, is prohibited unless there is a non-attached barrier between one's hand and the actual text. Right? We talked about that when we talked about ghusl, right, as well. Okay. Okay. So if a woman has her menstruation, right? So if we just make an example, so in January, she has her menstruation for 6 days, right? So 6 is between 3 and 10, and that's a valid menstruation. So she didn't pray, right? She didn't fast in that time, right? And then, right, after, and then in February, she had another menstruation, right? But this time it was for 8 days, right? So now we would consider that her habits, right, her norm of menstruation is now 8 days. And as long as it stays within 3 to 10, right, one's habits or custom will change, right? So in January, it was 6 days. And then February, it was 8 days. And then, so her regular habit will change as long as it's within those bounds, right? But another aspect of the dysfunctional bleeding is that if a woman has menstruation for above 10 days, right? Right. So we know that 10 is the maximum. And then anything above that is dysfunctional bleeding. Okay. But if a woman's habit, her regular habit, meaning the most recent menstruation that she had was 7 days, right? Or any amount of days between 3 and 10, right? And then, so in January, she has her menstruation for 7 days. February comes, right? She has bleeding for the first day, second day, third day, fourth day, right? Up to the 7th. But then she also has on the 8th, and then the 9th, and then the 10th, right? And then above 10, 11, 12, 13, right? So she has for 13 days total, right? So the actual menstruation part of that goes back to what her habit was in the previous menstruation, which was 7 days, right? So 7 days is considered menstruation, meaning the prayers that were done in those 7 days do not have to be repeated, right? The fasts that were done within those 7 days do not count, but they have to be repeated, right? But the additional 6 days, because it went above her habit and then above the maximum, right? The additional 6 days are considered dysfunctional bleeding. So if she did not pray in those times, right, then she'd have to make up those prayers. And so what she should do is that, so her menstruation in January is 7 days, right? When February comes and she sees blood for 3 days, then 4 days, then 5 days, then 6 days, then 7 days, right? Then everything is as normal. That is definitely menstruation, right? Even when it gets to 8 days or 9 days or 10 days, right? She should consider it as menstruation. She should not pray. She should not do any of the things that we just mentioned, right? But once it passes 10 days, then she knows for a fact that this anything above her habit from last month, which was 7, so anything above 7 is now dysfunctional bleeding. So once it passes 10 days, then there's certainty that there's istihada involved, that there's dysfunctional bleeding here. So as soon as it passes 10 days, then she will start praying again. I mean, she will start, she can start fast, she can fast, she can touch the Quran, she can recite the Quran, right, and so forth. Okay. Right, so if it goes above the habit and then above the maximum, then only the habit is considered menstruation. Anything above and beyond that is dysfunctional bleeding. But she will not know that when it passes her habits, that extra is dysfunctional bleeding until it goes above the maximum. Right, so those 3 days she will act like it's menstruation, because, for instance, say her habit in January was 7 days. Right, in February she sees 7 days, then 8 days, then 9 days, and then 10 days, and then it stops. Right, so now her new habit is 10 days, right, and all of that is menstruation. Right, so she won't be able to know for sure until she waits to see if it goes over the maximum. Okay, so when her menstruation ends within the 10 days, right, after the duration of her regular habit, right, then she will not have intercourse except after one of these 3 things. Okay, so if a woman has, if her habit is, say, for instance, 8 days, January her menstruation was 8 days and then it stopped, right? In February, and this is an issue that many people are unaware of, that if her January menstruation was 8 days, in February it stops at 5 days. Right, and February comes, she has bleeding for 5 days and then nothing. Right, a person may assume that, okay, my menstruation finished at 5 days, I can take a ghusl and now I can have intercourse. Right, even though she does take a ghusl at the end of the 5 days, and she does return to prayer, and she does take on the rulings of the one who is outside, who has finished her menstruation, right? But intercourse is not permitted until she reaches the amount of days that was her habit. So she would have to wait an extra 3 days in order to have intercourse, because it is very possible that the menstruation comes back and that there's just intermittent breaks in between. Right, so that it's not certain that the menstruation is definitely over, right? Because it could be that it stops at 5 days, right? And she assumes it's finished. She makes a ghusl, right? She prays, right? So the 6th day there's nothing, and then 7th day it comes back, right? So technically that 6th day is still considered menstruation, because intermittent breaks are considered as part of the 10 days, right? So if her menstruation stops prior to her habit from last menstruation, then she has to wait till her habit is finished, the amount of days of her habit is finished, in order for her to be able to have intercourse. Okay, so if her period ends within 10 days, right, but after the duration of her regular habits, right, then she may not have intercourse except after one of three things. First, right, her menstruation finishes, right, she has to perform a ghusl, so uh, she cannot have intercourse prior to performing a ghusl. Right. Second, if she doesn't have water, we already mentioned about the rules of tayammum. So tayammum is a substitute for ghusl as well, right? In the case where there's water is not present or water, right, is not usable. Or three, that a whole prayer time came and went without her praying it. She missed the prayer, right? Then she can have intercourse, right? Even if she did not perform a ghusl, right? That ruling is, it doesn't mean that you're allowed to miss the prayer, right? That ruling is only for people who are in a situation where their spouse doesn't really pray, right? Their spouse is not very religious, right? So say she doesn't pray, she doesn't really care about the rulings of ghusl, right? Then that would be against the rights of the husband, that he can never have intercourse with her until she takes ghusl, and she doesn't care about ghusl, right? So instead of him telling her that she has to make a ghusl, then he can just wait. If one prayer time goes out, right, then they are allowed to have intercourse, right? So that's the answer to a very rare situation, right? But she has to perform ghusl, right? That's the normal ruling, that she has to perform ghusl and then they can have intercourse, right? However, if her period ends exactly at the maximum, right, she has 10 days of bleeding and then her period finishes, right, then it is permissible for her to have intercourse with her spouse, even if she doesn't take ghusl, so even prior to taking ghusl, right? So he says if her period goes past 10 days, right, it is permissible to have intercourse with her as soon as it passes the 10th day, due to the certainty that the menstruation is complete and the extra bleeding is dysfunctional uterine bleeding, right? So if her menstruation stops at 10 days exactly, then you're allowed to have intercourse even prior to making ghusl. Even though ghusl is better, it is recommended to do ghusl first, but it's permissible even prior to the ghusl once the period ended exactly at 10 days, right? Or the period, the bleeding continued past 10 days, because just as we mentioned, right, once it passes 10 days, then there is certainty that that excess is anything that's excess from her habits is dysfunctional uterine bleeding, and it's not menstruation, and it is permissible to have intercourse during dysfunctional uterine bleeding. Okay, so that covers most of the issues, but there is one last aspect, that between two menstruations or between two types of bleeding, like for instance, a menstruation and postnatal bleeding, right? So for instance, a woman gives birth, right? For 1 month, she has postnatal bleeding, right? And then it stops, right? And then she has, there's a time period in between, and then she has her normal menstruation, returns again, right? It's necessary that the minimum duration of that period in between, of that time of purity in between the ending of the postnatal bleeding and the beginning of the next menstruation, or in between two menstruations, that there must be 15 days complete without any bleeding whatsoever, right? So January 1st, a woman has bleeding for 5 days. That's her menstruation, right? In order for her next menstruation to be considered to have begun, right, there has to be 15 days from the end of her first menstruation before the start of her next, right? So first 5 days of January, she has bleeding, right? 15 days, nothing. And then the 21st of January, she has bleeding again. That from 21st on is considered her second menstruation. It's separate from the first, right? So in order to separate between two types of bleeding, there must be 15 complete days of nothing, of no blood whatsoever, right? Which is called tuhur, And tuhur in Arabic means time of purity, right? It's an interval of purity between two menstrual cycles or between the postnatal bleeding and the menstrual cycle. Okay. So he says the minimum duration of tuhur, this interval of purity, is 15 complete days, 360 complete hours, yet it has no maximum duration, except when establishing a standard menstrual habit. Okay, so there's no maximum for the tuhur. It's very possible that a woman has menstruation on January and then has a time of purity for 3 months and then has another menstruation and then another 3 months and then another menstruation. It's very possible. It's also possible that a woman never has haid, right? So the time of being pure and not having haid, there's no maximum whatsoever, right? But there is a minimum. It has to be 15 days in order for two separate bleedings to be considered separate. Otherwise, they'll be combined. Okay. Okay, so we'll just read what he mentions here. He says postnatal bleeding, also known as nifas, is defined as blood that exits after delivery or after most of the baby has exited. Right, so if most of the baby has exited and there's a sign of blood, then the time will start from there, because it's very possible that the pregnancy continues for more hours, right, even though most of the baby is out. Right. Also, even after a miscarriage of a fetus, right, as long as the fetus is physically developed, right? If the fetus is later in the stages of pregnancy and there's a miscarriage, may Allah give us all salama and ease and protect us from such things, right? But if there is a miscarriage, right, and the fetus of the baby is formed physically, there's physically developed, you can see limb, you can see a hand, you can see different parts of the body clearly, right? Then it is also considered a postnatal bleeding if there's blood present after that. Right? But if the baby comes out, if it's an early miscarriage and the fetus is not formed, then it's not considered nifas. Right? So postnatal bleeding has no minimum duration, while its maximum duration is 40 days, 960 hours. Right? It is from, right, and this is just a rare situation. If someone had twins, the menstruation, the postnatal bleeding, if there's blood found, is counted after the first twin, after the first baby is born. Right? It has the same rulings as menstruation, so same things are prohibited in that time. Right? He says the following cases are considered to be dysfunctional uterine bleeding. Right? So these are not menstruation, it's not postnatal bleeding. Right? So any bleeding of a pregnant woman, even bleeding during delivery before most of the baby has exited. Right? So before most of the baby comes out, right, then that's still blood during pregnancy. Right? And that's considered, it's not considered postnatal bleeding. Second, bleeding after delivery, right, for more than 40 days. Because we mentioned the maximum is 40 days, anything beyond that is postnatal bleeding. If she bleeds past her normal habit of either menstruation or postnatal bleeding, and the bleeding exceeds the maximum duration, right, of either one, in that case, the bleeding after the duration of her habit, right, is considered dysfunctional uterine bleeding. Right, so her habit for last menstruation was 8 days. Right, this time she sees blood for 12 days. Right, so the 8 days is considered menstruation. The additional 4 days that was above the habit and then went above the maximum, right? That additional 4 days is dysfunctional bleeding. Same thing in postnatal bleeding. So she had a child in January 2020, right? And then she had 25 days of bleeding after that child was born, postnatal bleeding. Right? She has another child in January 2021. I think that's possible. Yeah, January 2021. Just excuse the example, right? But this time she has bleeding for 50 days. Right? So what is considered her menstruation? It would be really good if I could have those listening reply to this, just to see how people are understanding, if that's even possible. If anyone has, right? So January 2020, she had a child, then 25 days postnatal bleeding. January 2021, she had a child and then had 50 days. So it went above her habits and it also went above the maximum. So how many days is considered her postnatal bleeding and how many days considered dysfunctional bleeding? Okay. So I'll just answer it. I don't know how the question thing works here. The 25 days, right? The January 2021, right? The bleeding that is considered her postnatal bleeding is that which is the same as her previous habits. So the first child was born, it was 25 days. So at this time, it'll be considered 25 days of bleeding. The additional 25 days would be postnatal, would be dysfunctional bleeding. If it's her first child and it goes above the 40 daes maximum, then the 40 days is considered the postnatal bleeding, and anything additional will be considered dysfunctional bleeding, and she would have to act accordingly. She might have to make up the prayers in those last 10 days. So, lastly, he says any bleeding of a girl that has not yet reached adolescence, right? We mentioned that that's 9 lunar years. 9 lunar years is the minimum age for a woman to have purity, to possibly have purity. 9 lunar years, which is equivalent to 8 years and 9 months. 8 years and 9 months of the solar calendar. Okay, now how does one pray during the dysfunctional bleeding? Right. He says, dysfunctional uterine bleeding, istihada, is like a continuous nosebleed in regards to its legal ruling, right? So there is an issue that if a person has a condition in which something that would break your wudu is continuous for them, like for instance, a person has a constant nosebleed that does not stop, how do they pray? Right, because we know that bleeding breaks the wudu. So, and you can't make wudu while your wudu is being broken at the same time. So how do you pray? Right. Also, this occurs if person has, for instance, uncontrollable bowel movements, or someone has a catheter in where the urine is continuously coming out of them, right, without their control. Right. How do they make wudu? Right. So this is called these are the rulings of the person who's ma'zur. They are excused. Right. But there are conditions in order to be considered a person who is excused. Right. There are conditions. Right, that if she has her dysfunctional bleeding, right, but it's just here and there, right, it's a few, right, there's a small presence of blood, right, in the beginning of the day, sometime at the end of the day, right, then in that case, right, she will pray as normal, but she'll try to pray in between the times where there's no actual blood coming out, right, and this goes back to one's reasonable surety, that if you're reasonably sure that no blood is going to come out, right, at this moment, right, then, or if you wait a little bit, then the blood will stop, right, and then you can just prepare for prayer, pray, and then and pray as normal, then that's what one will do, right? But if it continues and the blood is continuous and there's not enough time for you to make wudu and to perform a whole prayer, right, where there's no blood at all coming out, right, then that will be where the ruling of the excused person comes in. Right, so he says that if such bleeding continues for the duration of an entire prayer time, for instance, between the time that Dhuhr enters until the time that Asr comes in. So that's one whole prayer time for Dhuhr, right? right? And you don't have to use the longest prayer time. You can use the smallest prayer time, like so between Maghrib and Isha, say is an hour and a half, right? So if within that hour and a half there is, he says that there's not enough time for you to make an entire a wudu and a prayer. So let me just read the text. He says, if such bleeding continues for the duration of an entire prayer time, when the woman must perform, then the woman must perform wudu at the beginning of each prayer time, just like someone with chronic urinary incontinence, constant diarrhea, constant gas release, right, or continuous bleeding from any part of the body, right? So those are the people who fall under this scope of excused, right? That she must perform a wudu at the beginning of each prayer time, right? There are three conditions for people with chronic excuses, right? The condition of establishing the excuse, right? So how do we tell if someone is an excused person? How do I know that if I am excused? That's the first condition. The second is, how long am I considered excused, right? That's second. And then the third is, when do I stop being considered an excused person, right? So we'll take each one, right? In order to be established as a person who is excused according to the Sharia, according to the sacred law, right? It is for the excuse to continue for the duration of an entire prayer time, such that the person is unable to perform wudu and the prayer without the occurrence of that excuse. Right? Afterwards, the person is considered chronically excused. Therefore, they may pray any amount of obligatory prayers or voluntary prayers after having performed wudu, even with the presence of that excuse. Right? The wudu performed in such a state is invalidated only by the expiration of the prayer time. Okay, and just to break that down, let's give an example. Okay, Zubair has a nosebleed, right? But the nosebleed's not stopping; it's just continuing, right? So, say he prays Asr like normal, and then after Asr he starts, right, just before Maghrib he starts experiencing this nosebleed, right? Maghrib time comes in, right? The blood is still coming and still coming and still coming, right? He doesn't have, the blood doesn't stop at all, enough that he could just perform a wudu, a quick wudu, right, and a quick prayer, right? There was not even enough time for that. The blood continues, and then Maghrib goes out. He never prayed. He was never able to pray Isha, right? So now he is considered an excused person, right? He is excused, and he will remain being in with the rulings of being excused, right, until the next conditions come, right? So how does he pray now, right? So what he will do is that once the time enters, each prayer time enters, he will make a new wudu, right? He will make a wudu even if the blood is flowing while he's making wudu. He will make a new wudu, right? One, right? Second, he can pray with that wudu anything he wants, either obligatory prayers, voluntary prayers, makeup prayers, right? He can pray anything that he wants. He can touch the Quran. He can, right? He can act just like anyone who had a normal wudu would act, right? And nothing will break, and the presence of that bleeding from his nose does not break his wudu, right? So he is excused insofar as that blood does not break his wudu. However, if he used the toilet or if he, right, did other things then that are not related to his excuse, then that would break his wudu. He would have to repeat the wudu, right? So the bleeding itself does not break the wudu. However, he does have to make a new wudu each time a new prayer time enters. Sorry, each time a prayer, each time a prayer time goes out, right? So he made wudu for Isha prayer, right? He can use that wudu all the way until Isha prayer time goes out, which is when Fajr enters, right? Then he made a new wudu for Fajr. He can continue with that wudu until the sun rises, which is the end of Fajr time, right? So that's he becomes excused because there was not enough, a whole prayer time came and went, and there was not enough time to perform even the bare minimum wudu and salah, right? Then he is excused, right? His rulings are just like the rulings of a pure person, except that he has to make a new wudu each time, and each time a new prayer time goes out, right? And that presence of that blood does not break his wudu, right? And he will continue to be in this state of being excused, right, until an entire prayer time comes and goes and not a single drop of that blood is coming out, right? So this applies to the nosebleed, applies to the dysfunctional bleeding as well, right? That one whole prayer time comes and goes and no presence of that excuse is there, right? At such a point, they are no longer considered uh, excused. However, if a prayer time comes and one drop comes out, they're still excused, right? Even if there's even a small presence of that excuse in a prayer time, then they're continuously to be excused, even if it lasts their whole life, right? Unless one entire prayer time comes and not even a single drop, not a single presence of that excuse or occurrence of that excuse comes. Are there any questions related to what we've taken, right, before we move on to physical impurities? So all of this is talking about ritual impurity. Just while anyone is thinking of their questions, and they can send them in either via the Zoom or the YouTube. Just a quick note that if a woman has this, or if anyone has this type of excuse, or if a woman has dysfunctional bleeding, right, or a person has, right, constantly has incontinence of urine or these things, right, if she feels that if the presence of the bleeding is not extreme to where it's constantly coming out, right, then it's best that she cleans up before each prayer, right? Each time she prays, right, that it's best that she clean herself and her clothing, right, or change her clothing before the next prayer. But if it becomes difficult, if there is undue hardship, then if she cleans herself and her clothing, she prays Dhuhr, right? Then again it comes out, and then also she has to clean and clean her clothing again, and then, right, every prayer she's going to have to do that. Right? If it becomes difficult, then she does not have to. She can leave the blood, right? She can leave the clothes, and she can pray. Right? It is permissible for her to pray, right? This also applies to somebody who has a wound, or somebody's, right, wounded and the blood just keeps coming and doesn't stop, or there's pus, or, right, may Allah give us ease and salama, right? And it's difficult for them to continuously remove that impurity before the next prayer, right? Then they are allowed to pray with it. Right? Allah says, "Ma ja'ala alaykum fid dini min haraj," that Allah has not placed upon you in your religion any undue hardship. Right? So these are dispensations, right, to remove those difficulties. So if there's no questions, we'll continue. The next part of the chapter is about physical impurities, right? We mentioned before, and we will mention later on, that in order for a person to pray, right, and this is all leading up to the prayer, in order for a person to pray, that they must be in a state of ritual purity, meaning that they have to have wudu, or if they need to, they must have a ghusl, right, in the cases where they need a ghusl, right? But also they must have physical purity, that their body must be clean from any impurities, the place of prayer must be clean from impurities, right? And their clothing must be clean from impurities. As Allah says, وَثِيَابَكَ فَطَهِّرْ, and your clothing, then purify it, right? And this is in the context of prayer, right? And if the clothing is commanded to be purified, then how much more so the body and the place of prayer, right? So the presence of physical impurities, we'll talk about what they are, on the clothing or on the person's body, right, or on the place of prayer can affect the validity of the prayer. The najasa, physical impurity or filth as it's translated, najasa, is of two types. There's heavy najasa, heavy impurities, and there's light impurities. The heavy impurities is that which there's no difference of opinion on, right? The light impurities is where there is seemingly a difference of opinion, right? So heavy physical impurity is considered blood that flows, flowing blood. We mentioned amongst the things that breaks the wudu is blood that comes out, right, from other than the private parts, right? And it doesn't just come out and stay at its spot, but it flows to another spot. So once it flows to a different spot, then that is considered flowing blood, and that breaks the wudu, and that blood is impure, right? So flowing blood is impure, feces, right, is impure, alcohol is impure, right? And after we read this small section as an introductory, we'll continue the whole section from next class because we're running low on time. We'll talk about the difference between alcohol that is from wine and alcohol that is non-wine alcohol, right? And semen or any sexual fluid or anything that comes out of the, or like semen or sexual fluid or urine, right, are all heavy impurities. So the feces includes that of humans, that of animals as well. They are both heavy impurities. Urine of a human is heavy impurities, right? Urine of animals as well, right? Except for with some exceptions. We'll talk about that, right? Sperm or any sexual fluid is impure. So these are major impurities, right? And these are the ones that affect the prayer the most because they're the most common as well. And the amount that is excused is much smaller than that of the light impurities, right? So we just want to take a few minutes to go through the discussion of khamar, right? Wine, right? The prohibitions of khamar, right, in the Quran, the word that is used to prohibit alcohol is the word khamar. And khamar, yukhamirul aql, it's something that envelops the intellect and covers the intellect, right? But khamar is a specific term that the Arabs understood to be a drink that is made from grapes, dates, or raisins. Grapes, dates, or raisins. Fermented dates, fermented grapes, or fermented raisins. Right, so that is specifically khamar. Right? Any drink that is made, any wine that is made from grapes, dates, or raisins, right? Its impurity, there's no doubt about it whatsoever. It's impure. It's haram to drink, even if just for one drop, right? It's haram to cook with it and to eat it, right? The excuse that it cooks out is not an excuse, right? That it doesn't fully cook out. Second, right, if it's on one's body, then it is absolutely impure, right? However, there's an issue that because in today's day we have other types of alcohol as well, right? So you have alcohol that's made from other than these three things, right? So those are called non-wine alcohol. So that would apply to, right, beer being from barley or vodka or whatever it is, right, made from other sources, right? Including rice wine and all of these things, right? So they as well are impermissible, right? However, they are impermissible to drink, right? If they're drinking, right, in the for the intention of intoxication, even a drop of it is impermissible with that intention. Second, it's impermissible to consume in the same way that alcohol is consumed, right? Thirdly, if their purpose in being used in cooking or other things is is not needed, right? If it's just for no benefits involved, right, then it's also prohibited, right? However, if there is a non-wine alcohol or something in some ingredient, in some product that is used to form the product for the actual product to be made, right? Or it's like, for instance, in some vanilla, there's some types of vanilla, they have this non-wine alcohol. You have in some perfumes, some colognes, there's this non-wine alcohol, right? Then if it's not with these conditions, if someone's not doing it in order to get intoxicated, or someone's not doing it to the extent that the amount that's in it is not enough to intoxicate, or they're not doing it in a way that's similar to the way that somebody would use an intoxicant, right? And the addition of that alcohol, that non-wine alcohol, has a purpose, right? Then it's not impermissible, right? Even though it's clear that caution can be used, right? If one wants to be cautious, then they can be. The same thing applies to colognes and perfumes. That if there is non-wine alcohol in a perfume or a cologne or hand sanitizer, which is very common these days, right? Then it's not considered impure to use externally, right? But it is still haram to use internally, right? To ingest internally, right? With the exclusion of the conditions that we just mentioned, right? If its presence in the thing is insignificant, it's just a small amount, right? It's not done in a way, it's not the amount that would intoxicate or used for no purpose. Like some medicines, some cough syrups, these things may have a small presence of alcohol, right? That is excused because it's a non-wine alcohol, and it's not used to the extent that its use is not without benefit, and its presence is not enough to intoxicate, right? So I hope that clarifies some things, especially in hand sanitizers and some perfumes and colognes, right? If one wants to be cautious, then they can stay away from those things. They can get non-alcohol alternatives, right? But it is not a point of contention that we can object to other people if they choose to use so. We can advise them to take the more cautious opinion, or we can leave them, right? Caution is recommended, right, in matters of purification. So the light filth, right, is described as the following: the urine of animals whose meat is permissible to eat, right? Whose meat is permissible to eat, right? The urine of horses, right? So if somebody works with horses, right, and right, the dropping of birds whose meat is not permissible to eat, right? Right. The droppings of birds that are permissible to eat is pure, except for chickens and ducks and geese, right? There's specific rulings related to them, right? But if a pigeon comes by, right? Okay. Right. So we mentioned that in the prayer, it is obligatory. It is a condition of the prayer to be valid that one's body must be free of impurities, right? That is a general statement, right? But there is a small amount that is excused, right? So if someone has a small amount of urine or a small amount of, right, of this or that on their body or their clothing, then there's a certain amount which is excused, and we'll talk about that next week. What exactly is that amount, right? And we'll talk about issues relating to people who have doubts, right? Doubts about the presence of impurities in their house, or the transferal of impurities. I touched this thing and my hand was wet, and then I touched the doorknob, and then, right? We'll talk about that, and it all goes back to the fact that, right, if there's something that is that's burdening you or making your religion very difficult, it's a sign that there's something wrong, and it's not from the religion, as we mentioned the verse of the Quran, that Allah says that He has not placed upon you in your religion any undue hardship, right? So in any situation like that, one should refer to a scholar and to consult, because it's very possible that we are putting upon ourselves more burdens than we're supposed to be. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless us and to give us the understanding of the religion, and to allow us to be of his of his closest servants. وصلى الله وبارك وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه والحمد لله رب العالمين. If there are any questions, we can take them. I'll just have a short time for questions, even though if not, then we'll stop here. I'll continue on Friday, inshallah.